I used to be an Air Force pilot. I'm not going to tell you when or in what country, for the sake of staying anonymous. Everything that I'm about to tell you is covered by a non-disclosure agreement, one which I am clearly about to violate. I should mention that I never flew any combat missions. I didn't work with those kind of planes. I flew transport planes, mostly carrying equipment from one research site to another, sometimes, but very rarely, flying only people. These were large, four-engine prop planes. I know that seems very old-fashioned nowadays. We're pretty much all military and commercial planes have jet engines. And I would be lying if I said that it wasn't the perfect plane for the job. But it's what we had to work with. There was a door which led to a middle area connecting the cockpit, with the large area where the equipment accompanied by some scientists was held. We called this the holding bay, and a smaller compartment with some emergency maintenance equipment, along with some electronics and a backup fuel tank for emergencies. The holding bay was open in the middle, with hooks on the ground and ceiling to secure the equipment being transported, and two long benches along the sides for the scientist and, if necessary, security to sit. The door to the middle area was lined with lead in case of radioactivity. The cockpit had all the usual gadgets, the altimeter, artificial horizon, fuel gauge, etc. It also had two separate radios, one for ground and flight control, and one to communicate with the people flying along in the back. And the second radio, although rarely used, could save the pilot's life. We could use it to ask the passengers to perform some maintenance, as we flew the plane without a co-pilot and had no one else to do it. According to my superiors, this was due to a lack of personnel. But as I sometimes flew completely finished experimental projects, after which I was always forced to sign an NDA the moment I landed, I suspect it may have been something to do with the secrecy as well. I never liked flying those missions. The lead-lined door connecting the holding bay to the middle area could only be opened from the cockpit. A while ago, while transporting something radioactive, some rookie scientist accidentally leaned against the button that opened the door, when there still was a button inside the holding bay, without realizing that he had touched the button or the fact that the door was now slightly ajar. To make sure no other pilots ran the risk of getting irradiated, the button inside the bay was removed. Lastly, there is a camera inside of the holding bay, sending a live feed to a small screen in the cockpit. When I asked about it, I was told that this was so if something went wrong in the bay, not only was there footage of it, but the pilots would be aware of it as well in case no one in the holding bay was able to tell him over the radio. That didn't do much to reassure me. One day while I was on duty, the alarm was sounded in one of the research facilities. This meant that all the personnel had to be evacuated, and my plane was sent along with another to do the job. Because we had to evacuate quickly, we could not refuel at the facility, and so the backup fuel tank was used to definitely be able to make the round trip. If the normal fuel tank was filled up entirely, the plane should be able to make it. But rather than cut it close, we set off with a surplus. Our call sign for ground control that day was Matmat, myself being Matmat 2 and the other plane 1. Matmat 1 and I landed on the two runways closest to the facility, and quickly taxied to the exit. Everybody was already waiting outside, and as soon as the ramps dropped, everyone rushed aboard. I don't think the ramps were open for longer than 30 seconds before we taxied back onto the runway and we took off. Looking on my screen, I saw a few people, scientists as well as security personnel, sitting in the middle area because of a lack of seats. Everything seemed fine at first glance, until I became aware of a scientist making excited hand movements to one of the security guys, whom I presumed to be the ranking officer. Using the radio, I asked if there was a problem back there.
Everything's fine. The scientist is just nervous is all.
I could hear the scientist in the background, but I could not make out what he was saying. I figured it wasn't an issue, and I focused on flying back to the base. Half an hour over some jungle, and we would be back near the city. I looked back on the camera to see the scientist still excitedly gesturing, this time clearly towards the bench on the other side. I saw some of the people sitting with their heads hanging down. It seemed unlikely that they would be able to fall asleep so quickly after the evacuation, with a man loudly arguing something in the same area as them, and so I contacted the officer again.
It's fine. They're tired. Just focus on the flying.
His patronizing tone annoyed me, but I decided that I would take his advice. More people were tired now, not only on the bench, but some were laying on the floor in the middle too. I had an anxious feeling about the whole situation, but I decided against contacting the officer again. He would probably just repeat himself anyway. Shortly after, a voice came over the radio, a different tone than the officer.
Hello?
Was the scientist that I had seen gesturing. You're breaking protocol. Only the ranking officer is allowed on the... I cut myself off when I looked back at the screen, seeing the officer laying on the ground and the scientist clearly panicking standing next to the door. What did you do to him?
You have to open the door. Quickly.
Is he alive? The scientist began shouting hysterically.
No. The plane has been compromised. You have to let me out. We have to do something about this. You cannot land. This can't be allowed to spread.
Almost everyone was unmoving, seemingly peacefully asleep. Only 3 people were still standing, all at the door, gesturing hysterically. I decided to break protocol and I opened the door. I pressed the button and the scientist with the radio fell through it. The other 2 people with him both letting out screams and falling to the floor. The scientist quickly pushed the door, closed behind him, and it automatically locked again. After about a minute, the door to the cockpit, which didn't have a lock, opened, and the scientist was standing next to me, breathing heavily, tears on his face. What happened in there? He took a deep breath before answering. The facility that had been evacuated conducted genetic experiments on animals. His group's guinea pigs were, ironically, actual guinea pigs. They were testing a growth hormone which was meant to speed up aging, hopefully letting the guinea pigs reach adulthood within a week of being born. Today, one of the mothers had given birth, and one of the scientists brought in 2 babies. While everybody was talking about how cute they were, one of the scientists asked, "Didn't the ultrasound show 3 babies?" Huh, strange. The scientist that had brought the babies in responded, "I guess I must have missed the 3rd one." A few of them went back to the guinea pig cages, only to find the cage open. The scientist promised that he had closed it. When they looked inside, there was no baby. The mother was nowhere to be found either. But to their dismay, however, the cage wasn't empty. A huge spider, as large as a grown man's hand, blacker than the night, was sitting in the corner. This spider was the project of a different group, a group with a more malicious mission. It had gotten out of its confinement, and as was the protocol in such a situation, the alarm was sounded and the facility evacuated. The scientist took another deep breath, shaky breath, and continued. When we entered the plane, we thought we were safe. The ones that knew what was happening shared a moment of relief, while the ones who had no idea tried to find out what had happened. However, when the ramp was almost closed, what looked like an orange gem just got in. I don't know if it was thrown or if it somehow jumped, but it landed in the corner where I was sitting. Inside of the gem was a pitch black spider. His breathing became quicker and new tears appeared in his eyes. I thought it was dead or frozen somehow, in stasis, but the gem. The further he went on, the harder it became for him to finish his sentences. The gem started melting somehow. The spider started wriggling its legs more and more the further the gem had melted. I went to Captain Vasquez and told him about it, but he gasped for air again and let out another shaky sigh. But he didn't believe me, thought I was hysterical, not thinking straight. The gem was entirely melted at this point, and the spider skidded over to the man sitting closest and it bit him. The scientist was crying at this point. Just bit him straight through his coat. A quick yelp and his head dropped to his chest. He was dead almost instantly. The spider had continued to a second man, and then a third. Only when the fifth man was bitten did more people realize what was happening. One of these security guards had managed to stomp on the spider, which killed it. But hundreds of smaller pitch-black spiders crawled out of the corpse, and people started dropping left and right. That was when the officer was bitten too, and the scientist had grabbed the radio. He paused. With very shaking breathing, he tried to get his bearings, and then he asked me, "Is there a way to blow up the plane?" I looked at him without saying anything. He insisted, "If these spiders get out, they could wipe out cities, and if it's weaponized." He grew silent again, seemingly lost in thought for a good 30 seconds, before speaking in a soft but determined tone. "That venom kills instantly. It needs to be destroyed." I told him about the backup fuel tank and I handed him my matchbox. I also offered him one of my cigarettes to smoke before he blew himself up, which he accepted. I got up and I showed him the fuel tank. The opening was obviously on the outside of the plane, so he would have to use some of the equipment there to get the thing open and drop a match in. I grabbed one of the parachutes, told the scientist to hold on so he didn't get sucked out, and said something along the lines of "Godspeed" before opening the door and jumping out of the plane. After opening my parachute, slowly floating down to Earth, I looked at the plane, flying straight one moment, a huge fireball lighting up the sky the next. I landed in the jungle. My parachute got stuck in one of the trees, and after gracefully falling to the ground and badly messing up my ankle, I started walking. Due to my sprained ankle, the walking went very slowly, and it wasn't until the next day that I got out of the jungle. I reported at headquarters, where I received medical attention and I was debriefed. An officer came in and informed me that Mot 1 had crashed in the jungle as well. "What a mess," he said, more to himself than to me. "It seems that you're the only survivor. An entire facility wiped out, just like that." He snapped his fingers. The pilot of Mot 1 had been a good friend of mine, who had gone through some basic training at the same time as myself. Shaken up by the loss of a friend, I asked the officer if they knew what had happened to him. "Not yet," he responded. "Some of our men have just got to the crash site, and are collecting the black box. He paused for a moment before adding, as an afterthought, "Oh, and a bunch of orange gems scattered in the area."